Hi, this is Tom Olsewski with eXp Realty again. And in this short video, I wanted to explain the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. This is a new document that should you decide to work with any real estate agent, you will have to sign as you move along with your home buying process. So let me go through it. So this first page is the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. This document hasn't changed. It's been around for a while. It basically says there's a seller's agent, and a seller agent under a listing agreement with the seller acts as the agent for the seller only. There's a buyer's agent, and a buyer's agent can, with buyer's consent, agree to act as agent for buyer only. And also there is a chance for agent representing both seller and buyer. And it kind of goes over responsibilities for each party. Second page, civil sections of the basically the legalese explanation of what I just went over for you. Next, we move to, this is the new document, buyer representation and broker compensation agreement. So because of this lawsuit, starting August 17th, every buyer is going to have to sign one of these documents, and it mostly deals with compensation. Typically, in the past, a seller would pay for the listing agent as well as the buyer agent. And I guess someone in Missouri didn't like that and decided to have this big class action lawsuit, which they won, which basically separates the seller commission from the buyer commission. In my humble opinion, nothing's really going to change, because you as the buyer, I will tell you, is this seller going to pay my broker's fee? And if they say no, you have a choice now of not taking a look at that particular property. So representation, let's get started here. Representation period. This particular document is only good for a maximum of 90 days, and after 90 days it would have to be renewed. Type of representation, if you work with me, it will be an exclusive representation. Then it talks about property type, and the default is single family residence, and that's typically what I deal with. I also deal with land. So if that were the case, we would check vacant land and go from there. Okay, getting back here. So next, after property type, it's location. Typically with me, it's going to be Riverside County or San Diego County. I work both counties. Additional description if needed, additional buyer preferences and priorities. There's a separate form for that as far as what exactly type of home you're looking for. Properties excluded from the representation. So if there were any particular properties that maybe you had a previous relationship with another agent and you want to put that there, that's where it would be identified. Next, we move into Section E, broker compensation. Notice the amount or rate of real estate commission is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between the buyer and the broker. See attached broker compensation form. So on the form, we will start with 3% that has been in the past typical broker compensation. but like it says here, it can be negotiated. So should a seller only offer 2.5%, I would reduce my commission to 2.5% and accept that for full payment. Payments received by broker from seller or others. So like I said, if the seller is willing to pay 2.5%, if broker receives compensation from the seller or others, broker representation of buyer, the amount shall be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay broker. So we're good there. Continued right to payment for broker involved properties. The continuation period shall be typically 90 days after the representation period or any extension. So that means if I showed you a property and this particular agreement expires, but you wish to move forward with a purchase of a property that I showed you within the 90-day period, this document would still be valid. Cancellation rights. Non-exclusive cancellation effective upon receipt, or exclusive cancellation effective 30 days after receipt of notice. And basically, I don't work with every buyer, and I also allow buyers within reason. If they're not happy with my services, we can cancel as well. I haven't had anybody cancel me in 20 years, and I don't expect to have any. I typically try and go above and beyond for all my buyer clients. Time to deliver buyer personal financial information. This is something new, and a lot of buyers aren't going to like it, but it's now part of the real estate process. There is a separate form, which I will show you in a little bit. It's basically goes over the financial capability of you as a buyer. Other financial consideration: if buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker, we can check that up front. That's fine, and we will only look at properties that the seller will pay for my broker compensation. Or buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. And as of today, I believe that's FHA or VA, but that's all changing constantly, so that may be okay. We move to the next page. This includes a broker compensation advisory form. We'll go over it. It's attached to this particular document. Compensation to broker. The amount and rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. So like I said, we start with 3%, but if a seller is willing to pay 2.5%, and I will do everything possible to make sure that that happens and they pay. Sellers are going to find out that if they say no, we're not going to offer any commission, then their home is not going to be shown because everybody wants to get paid. You work daily and you expect a check. If you don't get a check, you're not going to work. So that's going to be interesting to see how that goes. Broker's right to compensation. Broker shall be entitled to compensation from buyer if during representation period or any extension buyer enters into agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire any property, and the seller thereafter completes the transaction or is prevented from doing so by default. So it goes over that situation, continuation of rights. So it basically says the buyer's broker has rights for compensation, and instead of saying the seller is going to pay both the listing and the buyer up front, it's up for negotiation. That was the purpose of the lawsuit, to separate that. But like I said before, in my humble opinion, nothing is going to change because the sellers are still going to offer to pay compensation. And I will find out if they do pay compensation before we view a home, so that if you do not want to see it because they are not paying, that's your right, and we don't have to take a look at that. Cancellation of buyer representation agreement. Either buyer or broker may cancel this agreement by giving written notice at any time. And I have no problem releasing any buyer from this document as long as there's not something fishy going on. And I have a pretty good BS meter, but basically I haven't had to deal with that in 20 years. Talks about agency relationships. Buyer acknowledges receipt of the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. That was the first document defining a seller's agent, a buyer's agent, and a dual agent. Talks about properties excluded from representation, buyer obligations, dispute resolution. Typically, everything with real estate goes through mediation. You are a legally authorized signer. Basically, to purchase real estate, you have to be over 18. To have a valid contract, you can still purchase it, but the contract could be voidable. Entire agreement, and this is confirming compensation. Like I said, it's going to be 3%, which will become negotiable. Next form is Buyer's Investigation Advisory. This form has been around a while, and it basically says it's highly recommended or you are strongly advised to investigate the condition and suitability of all aspects of the property, included but not limited to the following: general conditions, square footage, wood destroying, soil stability, water utilities, environmental hazards, earthquakes and flooding, and so on. Even as far as things and conditions in a neighborhood. It's your responsibility as a buyer. So this is broker compensation advisory. This is a new document, and it basically says when sellers list their property for sale through a real estate broker, they agree to pay the seller's broker when escrow closes. Listing agreement compensation is fully negotiable, and an additional compensation if buyer is unrepresented, meaning that if an unrepresented buyer goes to a listing agent, it's what's referred to as dual agency. It's not really recommended because you're not going to get the true story. Like when you work with me as a buyer, I'm going to tell you the good, bad, and ugly about a property. If you go and you work with directly with a listing agent, they're just going to tell you all the good and why you should buy it. So that's not a good thing generally, and a lot of states outlaw it across the country. Broker agreements with buyer representation compensation is fully negotiable. As I had stated previously, if the seller pays the compensation, buyer negotiates for seller to compensate buyer's broker. A buyer may make a conditional offer to the seller by including a term in the purchase offer asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker. If the buyer has already agreed to pay their own broker pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. If such a term is included in the purchase offer, the request will become one term among many that the seller may accept, reject, negotiate by way of a counteroffer, meaning that we can ask for compensation. The seller doesn't necessarily have to agree with that. So if we get into a very hot market where there's multiple buyers going after a property, this will come into play where you as a buyer potentially may have to pay a buyer's broker compensation. Changing practice related to a seller's broker's offer compensation. Historically in California, many sellers brokers use multiple listing services to make a unilateral offer to compensate a buyer's broker who procured a buyer for the seller's property. So based on the NAR settlement, MLS will not publish compensation for a buyer's broker within the MLS, which basically means I just have to pick up the phone and as I talk about setting an appointment, I will ask the listing agent, will your seller pay buyer broker compensation, yes or no? Okay, here's another form. It's been around for a while. It basically says possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. It's basically letting everybody know that we as agents do not work with just one buyer or one seller, and it's just a disclosure of that. California Consumer Privacy Act advisory disclosure notice that this basically says during the process of buying and selling real estate, your personal information will be collected and likely shared with others, including real estate licensees, multiple license services, and so forth, but we're not going to sell your information to people that don't need it. Okay, this is another new form. This is a form. It's going to be helpful to buyers, and they may not like it, but as part of the buyer-broker agreement, there is a buyer financial and personal information sheet. This is helpful because I can explain what's needed. I will give you net sheet analysis and closing cost analysis, and you'll also work with your lender with this particular document, so you'll have all your information compiled here as far as how much cash you have, who's your lender, what type of loan are you working with, and I always recommend working with multiple lenders, so I can typically save my clients thousands of dollars and make life a whole lot easier. So I always recommend talking to multiple lenders, and if one lender offers a particular rate, you go back to the other lender and say, hey, I got this rate from this guy. This will get you the best possible fees and rates for your loan. Other information, whether it's a 1031 exchange, investment, current housing situation, whether you own or you're renting, property ownership if you're a first-time buyer. I love working with first-time buyers. I take my time. I go over things in detail so that they have a full understanding of what they're getting into. And that's it as far as the new buyer-broker agreement. I know this has been a little bit long, but if you should have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, 951-506-5744. Information will be placed at the end of the video. Thanks for listening. Hopefully I didn't bore you, but there's a lot of new stuff going on in the real estate world as of August 17th, 2024.